Welcome to our deep dive into Claire Colebrook's work on extinction.
Oh yes, unsettling and provocative.
We're going to be focusing on 2 volumes from her Essays on Extinction series,
Right.
Death of the Post-Human and
Okay.
Sex After Life.
It's quite a series.
Yeah.
A series that, like Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols, signals a dismantling of cherished philosophical concepts.
Yeah.
In Colebrook's case, she really takes aim at the humanist narratives that have dominated our thinking about the world.
I was struck by that right from the introduction.
Oh yeah.
Colebrook argues that traditional philosophical frameworks just aren't equipped to deal with the reality of extinction, especially in the age of climate change.
Yes, and she zeroes in on this idea that we can't rely on 20th century human-centered models of thought
Right.
to understand what's happening.
Okay.
Even the concept of globalism, which seems like a natural response to a global crisis, comes under fire in her work.
That surprised me at first.
Oh, really?
Why would she critique globalism? Isn't that about coming together as a planet to face these challenges?
Well, Colebrook's point is that globalism often relies on this image of Earth as a bounded, manageable object. Almost like we can just tweak a few variables and control the whole system.
Okay.
It reinforces this dangerous fantasy of human control over nature.
So it's like we're still trying to fit this incredibly complex and chaotic phenomenon into a neat little box that we can manage and control.
Exactly.
But climate change just doesn't work that way, does it?
Exactly. And this is where Colebrook's call for thinking non-globally comes in.
Okay.
It's about acknowledging the interconnectedness of things without falling back on those comforting but ultimately illusory narratives of a unified Earth.
Okay, so how do we even begin to think non-globally?
Well,
Sounds pretty abstract. What would that look like in practice?
it's a challenging question, and Colebrook doesn't offer any easy answers, but she does give us some clues. For example, she points to the work of thinkers like Spinoza and Deleuze, who offer alternative ways of conceiving of the relationship between the human and the non-human, the individual and the collective.
So it's about moving beyond those dualistic ways of thinking that have dominated Western philosophy for so long. The mind-body split, the subject-object divide.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that we're not these isolated, self-contained units, but rather part of a vast, interconnected web of relations.
Precisely. And this is where Colebrook's work starts to get really interesting.
Right?
Because she takes these philosophical ideas and applies them to the very concrete, very material problem of extinction.
Right. And this is where that concept of the death drive starts to emerge, which you alluded to earlier.
Yes. The death drive is a central theme that runs throughout Colebrook's work.
Yeah.
It's this idea that there's a tendency within philosophy itself and within Western thought more broadly to negate the very life it seeks to affirm.
Okay. Unpack that a bit for me. I'm not sure I fully grasp what she means by death drive in this context.
Well, think about it in relation to the history of philosophy.
Okay.
How often have we seen the body, for example, being denigrated or dismissed as something that needs to be transcended or overcome in order to achieve true knowledge or liberation?
Right. It's like there's this deep-seated fear of the body, of its messiness, its vulnerability, its mortality.
Exactly.
And so we try to escape from it, to control it, to deny its reality.
Exactly. And Colebrook argues that this fear, this denial, is ultimately a form of the death drive.
Okay.
It's a way of turning away from the vibrancy and complexity of life, of trying to impose order and control on a world that's inherently chaotic and unpredictable.
So how does this death drive manifest itself in our thinking about extinction?
In a number of ways. For example, Colebrook critiques those narratives that try to find meaning or redemption in the face of extinction.
Okay.
She argues that these narratives, even when they seem well-intentioned, can actually reinforce those very patterns of thought that have led us to this point.
You mean like those narratives that see extinction as some kind of necessary step in human evolution?
Yeah.
Or that find solace in the idea that nature will somehow heal itself after we're gone?
Precisely. Colebrook argues that these narratives are still caught within that same humanist framework that places humans at the center of the story.
Right.
They're still trying to make sense of extinction in terms of human meaning and purpose.
And that's what she's challenging us to move beyond, right?
Exactly.
It's about letting go of those anthropocentric narratives and confronting the reality of extinction on its own terms.
Exactly. And this is where her work becomes incredibly unsettling,
Okay.
but also incredibly liberating,
Okay.
because it forces us to confront the limits of our own understanding, to acknowledge that there are forces at play in the universe that we may never fully comprehend.
It's like she's saying that we need to learn to live with the discomfort of not knowing,
Yeah.
of not having all the answers.
Yes, and this is where her engagement with Nietzsche becomes particularly relevant.
Okay.
Because Nietzsche, perhaps more than any other philosopher, forced us to confront the death of God, the collapse of those metaphysical certainties that had grounded Western thought for centuries.
And Colebrook is suggesting that we're facing a similar kind of crisis today.
Yeah.
A crisis of meaning, a crisis of values, a crisis of our very understanding of what it means to be human in a world facing extinction.
Precisely. And just as Nietzsche called for a revaluation of all values in the wake of the death of God,
Okay.
Colebrook is calling for a radical rethinking of our most fundamental assumptions in the face of extinction.
Okay, so we've got this idea of the death drive, the critique of humanist narratives, the influence of Nietzsche. But where does the post-human fit into all of this?
Well, Colebrook is very critical of the term post-human, arguing that it often simply reinscribes those same humanist assumptions it claims to transcend.
So it's like we're just slapping a new label on the same old ways of thinking.
Exactly. For example, she points out that many post-humanist thinkers still cling to the idea of a unified subject. Even if that subject is no longer exclusively human,
Okay.
they still talk about agency, consciousness, intentionality concepts that are deeply rooted in humanist philosophy.
So what's her alternative?
Right.
If we can't rely on those humanist or even post-humanist frameworks,
Yeah.
how are we supposed to think about ourselves and our place in the world in the face of extinction?
This is where her concept of thinking non-globally becomes crucial.
Okay.
It's about moving beyond those subject-object, human, non-human binaries and embracing a more relational, process-oriented way of understanding the world.
It sounds like she's drawing on ideas from thinkers like Deleuze and Guattari,
Yes.
with their emphasis on becoming on flows on assemblages.
You're absolutely right. Colebrook is deeply indebted to Deleuze and Guattari, as well as to other thinkers like Spinoza, Bergson, and Whitehead, who offer alternative ways of conceiving of the relationship between the human and the non-human, the mind and the body, the subject and the world.
So instead of trying to define the human in opposition to the non-human,
Yes.
it's about recognizing our interconnectedness, our interdependence, our embeddedness within these larger systems and processes.
Precisely. And this is where her work gets really exciting.
Okay.
Because it opens up new possibilities for thinking about ethics, politics, aesthetics, even spirituality in the face of extinction.
Okay, so we've laid out some of the key theoretical foundations of Colebrook's work.
Right.
But how does all of this play out in her analysis of concrete phenomena like climate change, technological innovation, and social and political movements?
That's where her work takes a fascinating turn, because she starts to connect these abstract philosophical ideas to the very real, very material challenges of our time.
Okay.
For example, in Death of the Posthuman, she offers a brilliant analysis of the ways in which climate change is disrupting those traditional narratives of progress and control that have shaped Western thought for centuries.
It's like climate change is forcing us to confront the limits of our own knowledge.
Yeah.
The limits of our own power, the limits of our own ability to shape the world according to our will.
Exactly. And she argues that this confrontation can be both terrifying and liberating
Yeah.
because it forces us to rethink our most fundamental assumptions about who we are, where we come from, and where we're going.
Now, one of the things that struck me about Death of the Posthuman is Colebrook's critique of the effective turn in philosophy. It seems like she's wary of simply embracing affect as a solution to the problems of humanism or posthumanism.
That's a really astute observation.
Okay.
And it gets to the heart of her critique of much contemporary thought.
Okay.
She argues that many thinkers, in their eagerness to move beyond the limitations of reason and objectivity, have swung too far in the opposite direction, embracing a kind of uncritical celebration of feeling and emotion.
So it's like they're throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah.
They're rejecting the excesses of rationalism, but they're not offering a viable alternative.
Precisely. And Colebrook argues that this uncritical embrace of affect can actually be quite dangerous.
Okay.
Because it can lead to a kind of romanticization of suffering, a fetishization of the body, even a glorification of violence.
Okay, so if we're not supposed to simply embrace affect, what is Colebrook proposing instead?
Well,
What's her alternative to this kind of uncritical emotionalism?
she doesn't offer any easy answers, and I think that's part of what makes her work so challenging and so rewarding.
Okay.
But she does suggest that we need to find a way to think about affect that's both more nuanced and more critical.
So it's not about rejecting affect altogether,
Yeah.
but about understanding its complexities, its ambiguities, its potential for both liberation and oppression.
Exactly. And this is where her engagement with thinkers like Foucault, Deleuze, and Derrida becomes so crucial,
Okay,
because
sorry.
these thinkers offer us ways of thinking about power, desire, and language that move beyond those simple binaries of reason and emotion, subject and object, self and other.
It's like she's trying to find a way to hold these different perspectives in tension with each other,
Yeah.
to acknowledge the importance of both reason and emotion,
Right.
of both the individual and the collective, of both the human and the non-human.
Precisely. And I think this is what makes her work so relevant to the challenges of our time.
Okay.
Because we're living in a world where those old certainties are breaking down, where the boundaries between categories are blurring, where the very foundations of our understanding of ourselves and the world are shifting beneath our feet.
And Colebrook is offering us not a set of answers,
Right.
but a set of tools for navigating this uncertain terrain, for thinking critically, for asking difficult questions, for embracing the complexities and contradictions of a world on the brink of radical transformation.
Now I think it's time we transition to sex after life.
Okay.
It's here that Colebrook really delves into the complexities of gender and sexuality,
Right.
and how those categories are being challenged and reshaped in the face of extinction.
Okay. I have to admit, the title Sex After Life is a bit provocative.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder, where exactly is she going with this?
Well, right from the start, Colebrook disrupts our expectations. She's not interested in offering some utopian vision of a post-gender or post-sexual future.
Okay.
In fact, she's quite critical of those kinds of narratives.
So she's not buying into those ideas of transcending the body, of
Okay.
achieving some kind of pure disembodied consciousness.
Not at all. Instead, she's interested in exploring the ways in which gender and sexuality are being reconfigured, reimagined, even weaponized in the context of the Anthropocene.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example of how she approaches this.
We'll take her analysis of the figure of woman in relation to extinction.
Right.
Colebrook points out that woman has often been used as a symbol of a return to nature, to a more authentic or primal way of being.
Right. I've seen that kind of imagery a lot.
Yes,
The earth goddess, the nurturing mother, the wise woman who holds the secrets of the natural world.
exactly.
Yeah.
But Colebrook argues that these narratives, even when they seem empowering or progressive, can actually be quite problematic.
Okay.
Because they often rely on essentialist notions of femininity, on the idea that women are somehow closer to nature, more intuitive, more emotional.
So it's like these narratives are still trapped within those same old gender binaries that they claim to be challenging.
Precisely. And that's where her concept of extinction comes in.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that true liberation doesn't lie in simply inverting those existing hierarchies,
Okay.
or in romanticizing some pre-human, pre-linguistic state of nature.
Okay, so if extinction isn't about some literal disappearance of one sex or the other, what is it about?
Well,
I'm still a little fuzzy on that concept.
it's a slippery concept for sure.
Yeah.
But I think the key is to understand it as a kind of provocation, a challenge to those ways of thinking that try to define us in terms of fixed categories and identities.
It's about disrupting those essentialist notions of gender and sexuality and opening up new possibilities for thinking about who we are and how we relate to each other.
Exactly. And I think this is where Colebrook's work becomes incredibly relevant to contemporary debates about gender identity, transgender rights, and the fluidity of sexual desire.
That's fascinating. It sounds like she's pushing us to move beyond those old debates about nature versus nurture,
Yes.
essentialism versus constructivism, and to embrace a more complex and nuanced understanding of how gender and sexuality are shaped by a whole range of factors: biological, social, cultural, political.
Absolutely. And I think this is one of the most important contributions of Sex After Life.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that there's no one right way to be a woman, no one right way to be a man, no one right way to express our sexuality. It's
Yeah.
about embracing the diversity and fluidity of human experience.
This has been an incredibly thought-provoking discussion so far. We've covered a lot of ground, from the death drive of philosophy to the complexities of extinction. But there's still so much to explore in Colebrook's work.
Yeah.
I'm particularly interested in her analysis of the role of technology and media in shaping our understanding of extinction.
Yes. That's a crucial aspect of her work, and one that she explores in depth in both Death of the Posthuman and Sex After Life. She argues that we can't understand the contemporary experience of extinction without taking into account the ways in which technology and media are mediating our relationship to the world.
Okay, so before we dive into that, I think we need to take a break and let all of these ideas sink in a bit.
Huh.
When we come back, we'll continue our exploration of Colebrook's work, focusing on her analysis of technology media and the cultural politics of extinction.
Sounds good. Welcome back to our deep dive into Colebrook's thought. You know, it's fascinating how she connects those abstract philosophical ideas we were discussing to the very concrete ways we experience the world,
Yeah.
especially through technology and media.
That's what I'm really curious to dig into now. It feels like we're constantly bombarded with images of environmental destruction
Right.
and warnings about the future. Does Colebrook think this is helpful?
Yeah.
Or does it just feed into that death drive we talked about?
That's a really important question, and Colebrook's take on it is quite nuanced.
All right.
She acknowledges the power of images and media to raise awareness and mobilize action, but she also warns against what she calls the pornography of extinction.
Okay, pornography of extinction. That's a pretty strong term. What exactly does she mean by that?
She's referring to the ways in which images of environmental destruction can become aestheticized, even fetishized to the point where they lose their power to shock or motivate us.
Okay.
It's like we become desensitized to the horror of what we're seeing.
That makes sense. It's like those gruesome images of war or famine that we might see on the news.
Right.
At a certain point, they can start to feel almost abstract, disconnected from the reality of the suffering they depict.
Exactly. And Colebrook argues that this can be a real danger when it comes to extinction, because if we become desensitized to the reality of what's happening, if we start to see it as just another spectacle, then it becomes much harder to mobilize the kind of collective action that's needed to address the crisis.
So it's like we're caught in this double bind.
Yeah.
We need to be aware of the threat of extinction. But we also need to find ways to engage with it that don't just feed into this cycle of desensitization and despair.
Precisely. And Colebrook doesn't offer any easy solutions, but she does suggest that we need to be more critical of the ways in which extinction is being represented and mediated, and to find new ways of engaging with it that move beyond the spectacle.
Now, thinking about those representations of extinction, one thing that comes to mind is how the figure of the human is often portrayed in relation to nature,
Right.
especially in apocalyptic narratives.
That's a really insightful observation, and it's something that Colebrook addresses directly in her work.
Okay.
She argues that many of those narratives reinforce those same old humanist assumptions that we need to challenge.
You mean like those narratives that see humans as the ultimate cause of environmental destruction,
Right.
as a kind of virus on the planet?
Exactly. Colebrook acknowledges the destructive impact of human activity on the environment, but she's wary of narratives that simply demonize humans, or that see the solution in terms of some kind of return to a pre-human state of nature.
So it's like she's saying that even those narratives that are critical of human behavior can end up reinforcing a kind of anthropocentrism because they're still defining the problem and the solution in terms of the human.
Precisely. And this is where her call for thinking non-globally becomes so important.
Okay.
Because it's about moving beyond those human-centered ways of thinking and embracing a more relational, process-oriented understanding of the world.
It seems like this is a recurring theme in Colebrook's work. This idea that we need to move beyond those traditional binaries, human nature, culture, mind, body, and embrace a more fluid and interconnected way of understanding the world.
Absolutely. And I think it's one of the most important contributions of her work.
Okay.
Because those binaries are so deeply ingrained in our thinking,
Right.
so pervasive in our language, that we often don't even realize how much they're shaping our perceptions of the world.
Okay, so let's talk a little more about how Colebrook sees technology fitting into all of this.
Okay.
On the one hand, technology has obviously played a major role in driving the environmental crisis.
Right.
But on the other hand, it's also being touted as a potential solution to that crisis.
Yeah.
So where does she come down on this?
It's a complex issue, and Colebrook doesn't offer any easy answers.
Yeah.
She acknowledges the ways in which technology has contributed to the problems we're facing, but she's also interested in exploring the potential of technology to help us imagine and create new ways of living in a world that's increasingly interconnected and unpredictable.
So it's not about rejecting technology outright, but about using it in more thoughtful and ethical ways.
Exactly. And I think this is where her engagement with thinkers like Deleuze and Guattari becomes really relevant.
Okay.
Because they offer us a way of thinking about technology not as something that's inherently good or bad, but as a set of tools that can be used for different purposes with different effects.
Right. They talk about technology as a kind of assemblage, a network of interconnected flows and forces that can be harnessed for both creative and destructive purposes.
Precisely. And I think Colebrook is suggesting that we need to be more aware of the ways in which technology is shaping our thoughts or feelings, our behaviors, our very understanding of the world. We need to be more critical of the narratives that are being told about technology, both the utopian and the dystopian ones.
So it's not about embracing technology uncritically or rejecting it out of hand.
Right.
It's about finding a way to engage with it in a more nuanced and thoughtful way.
Yeah.
Recognizing both its potential and its dangers.
Yes. And I think this is where Colebrook's work is so timely and so important.
Okay.
Because we're living in a world where technology is evolving at an unprecedented rate and where those technological changes are having a profound impact on every aspect of our lives.
And she's challenging us to be more aware of those changes, more critical of the ways in which technology is being used,
Right.
more creative in imagining how it could be used differently.
Exactly. And I think this is a challenge that's relevant to all of us, regardless of our background or our area of expertise. Because we're all living in this technologically mediated world, and we're all being shaped by it in ways that we may not even fully realize.
Now, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier.
Go.
This idea of finding a way to affirm life, even in the face of extinction.
Right.
It seems like Colebrook is really grappling with this question, trying to find a way to move beyond despair and nihilism.
Absolutely. And this is where her work takes on an ethical and even spiritual dimension.
Okay.
Because it's not just about analyzing the problem of extinction, it's about finding a way to live meaningfully and purposefully in a world that's facing unprecedented challenges.
And it seems like she's drawing on a wide range of sources for inspiration here, from ancient philosophy to contemporary art and literature.
You're right. She engages with thinkers like Spinoza and Nietzsche, but also with writers like Kafka and Beckett, filmmakers like Tarkovsky, and Lynch artists like Beuys and Kiefer.
And it's through these engagements that she starts to articulate a vision of what she calls a life beyond the human.
That's a really crucial concept in her work. And it's important to understand that she's not talking about some kind of transcendence of the human,
Okay.
some kind of escape from our embodied existence.
So it's not about becoming post-human in the sense of leaving our humanity behind.
Not at all. It's more about recognizing the limits of human exceptionalism, of those anthropocentric narratives that have shaped our thinking for so long.
Right.
It's about acknowledging our interconnectedness with the non-human world, our dependence on the vast web of life that sustains us.
It sounds like she's trying to find a way to affirm life in all its forms, even those forms that might seem alien or threatening to us.
Precisely. And I think this is where her work becomes incredibly challenging, but also incredibly hopeful.
Okay.
Because it's about letting go of those old ways of thinking, those old ways of seeing the world, and opening ourselves to the possibility of something radically new.
Now, one thing that I've been struggling with throughout our discussion is this tension between the urgency of the ecological crisis and the need to think carefully and critically about these complex philosophical ideas.
Yeah.
It's like, on the one hand, we need to act now to avert disaster. But on the other hand, we need to take the time to really grapple with these fundamental questions about what it means to be human in a world facing extinction.
That's a tension that Colebrook herself acknowledges and grapples with throughout her work.
Okay.
And I don't think there's any easy answer to that question,
Sure.
but I do think that her work offers us a way to think about that tension, to hold those two perspectives in mind at the same time.
So it's not about choosing between action and reflection,
Right.
but about finding a way to integrate those two modes of engagement.
Exactly. And I think that's a really valuable insight, especially in a world where we're constantly being bombarded with information, where we're pressured to make quick decisions, where it's so easy to feel overwhelmed and paralyzed by the scale of the challenges we're facing.
So it's about finding a way to be both thoughtful and effective, both critical and compassionate, both engaged with the world and aware of our own limitations.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really powerful message that emerges from Colebrook's work.
It's
a message that's both challenging and inspiring, both unsettling and ultimately hopeful.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the role of art and literature in all of this.
Okay.
It seems like Colebrook sees these creative forms as playing a crucial role in helping us imagine new possibilities for life beyond the human.
Absolutely. She argues that art and literature have the power to disrupt those dominant narratives, to challenge our assumptions, to open up new ways of seeing and being in the world.
So it's not just about escapism or entertainment.
Right.
It's about using these creative forms to engage with those big questions about extinction,
Yeah.
about the future of humanity, about the relationship between the human and the non-human.
Exactly. And Colebrook is particularly interested in those works of art and literature that don't shy away from the darkness,
Okay.
the complexity, the ambiguity of the Anthropocene. She's drawn to those works that explore the limits of language, the fragility of meaning, the strangeness of our own embodied existence.
Can you give me an example of the kind of artist or writer she's talking about?
Sure. She frequently discusses writers like Franz Kafka, Samuel Beckett, and J.G. Ballard, whose works often explore themes of alienation, absurdity, and the breakdown of communication.
Okay.
She's also drawn to visual artists like Anselm Kiefer, whose work often incorporates materials like lead ash and straw to evoke themes of destruction and renewal.
It sounds like she's looking for works of art that are both disturbing and illuminating,
Yeah.
both unsettling and ultimately life-affirming.
Yes, and I think that's a really important point.
Okay.
Because it's easy to fall into despair or nihilism when we confront the reality of the Anthropocene, but Colebrook is suggesting that there's another way, a way of engaging with the darkness without being consumed by it,
Okay.
a way of finding meaning and purpose even in the face of extinction.
Now, we've been talking a lot about Colebrook's solo work, but I want to make sure we touch on Twilight of the Anthropocene Idols, which she co-authored with Tom Cohen and J. Hillis Miller.
Mm-hmm.
That book seems to offer a really interesting counterpoint to her solo work, while also building on many of the same themes.
That's a great observation, and it's important to remember that Twilight of the Anthropocene Idols is very much a collaborative work,
Okay.
with each author bringing their own unique perspective to the table.
And the title itself, of course, is a direct nod to Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols.
Exactly. And just as Nietzsche took aim at the cherished idols of his day, morality, religion, metaphysics, Colebrook, Cohen, and Miller are taking aim at the idols of the Anthropocene era.
And what are those idols exactly?
Well, they range from the idea of human exceptionalism to the myth of technological progress, from the ideology of consumer capitalism to the fantasy of limitless growth.
So it's about challenging those dominant narratives that have shaped our understanding of the world and our place within it.
Precisely. And just as Nietzsche called for a reevaluation of all values in the wake of the death of God, Colebrook, Cohen, and Miller are calling for a radical rethinking of our most fundamental assumptions in the face of the Anthropocene.
Now, one of the things that struck me about Twilight of the Anthropocene Idols is the emphasis on language and rhetoric.
Right.
It seems like they're really interested in how the ways we talk about the Anthropocene are shaping our understanding of the problem and our potential responses to it.
Yes, that's a really important theme that runs throughout the book, and I think it connects back to Colebrook's earlier work on the death drive of philosophy.
Okay.
Because one of the key arguments in Twilight of the Anthropocene Idols is that many of the ways we talk about the Anthropocene are actually reinforcing those same anthropocentric narratives that we need to challenge.
Can you give me an example of what they're talking about?
Sure. Take the concept of sustainability, for example.
Okay.
It's a term that's thrown around a lot these days, and it often seems to imply that we can somehow continue with business as usual, just with a few tweaks here and there. But Colebrook, Cohen, and Miller argue that this kind of thinking is actually part of the problem,
Okay.
because it assumes that the human can somehow be separated from the environment.
Yeah.
That we can somehow manage and control the natural world without fundamentally changing our own ways of living.
So it's like that globalism critique all over again, this idea that we can somehow impose our will on the planet and bend it to our needs.
Exactly. And they argue that we need to move beyond this kind of anthropocentric thinking and embrace a more radical vision of the future, a vision that acknowledges the interconnectedness of all things and the need for fundamental change.
Now, another concept that they introduce in Twilight of the Anthropocene Idols is the idea of trolling anthropos.
Right.
Can you explain what they mean by that?
It's a provocative concept, and it's one that they develop in a number of different ways throughout the book.
Okay.
But at its core, it's about disrupting those dominant narratives of human exceptionalism and control that have shaped the Anthropocene era.
So it's about using humor, irony, satire, even absurdity to challenge those assumptions and open up new possibilities for thought and for being.
Exactly. And they draw on a wide range of examples to illustrate this point,
Oh, yeah.
from the work of artists like Banksy and Aya Weiwei to the online culture of trolling and meme making.
Okay, so we've got the critique of anthropocentrism, the emphasis on language and rhetoric,
Right.
the concept of trolling anthropos. But where does all of this leave us?
Yeah.
What's the takeaway message of Twilight of the Anthropocene Idols?
Well, I think one of the key messages is that we need to be more critical of the narratives that are being told about the Anthropocene,
Okay.
both the optimistic and the pessimistic ones.
So it's not about denying the seriousness of the crisis, but about recognizing that those narratives are often shaped by hidden agendas, by vested interests, by unconscious biases.
Exactly, and they argue that we need to be more aware of those biases, more critical of those narratives, more willing to challenge the assumptions that underpin them.
So it's about thinking for ourselves,
Yeah.
about questioning the received wisdom, about finding new ways to understand and respond to the challenges of the Anthropocene.
Precisely. And I think that's a message that's both empowering and challenging because it suggests that we're not simply passive victims of circumstance,
Okay.
but that we have the capacity to shape the future even in the face of seemingly overwhelming odds.
It's been an incredibly thought-provoking conversation so far.
Yeah.
And I feel like we've just scratched the surface of these complex ideas.
Right.
I'm especially curious to hear more about this life beyond the human that Colebrook keeps hinting at. What does that actually look like?
That's where we'll pick up in the final part of our deep dive. Colebrook, Cohen, and Miller offer some intriguing clues about what a post-anthropocentric future might entail, but they also acknowledge that we can't fully grasp it from our current perspective. It's a future that we can only begin to imagine,
Right.
to glimpse through the cracks in the dominant narrative.
Okay, I'm eager to hear more about those cracks and those glimpses. But for now, let's take another break and come back refreshed and ready to delve into the final part of our exploration.
Sounds good.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Claire Colebrook's work on extinction. You know, throughout this conversation, we've been circling around this idea of a life beyond the human. I'm really curious to unpack what that might mean,
Yeah.
especially as we confront the reality of the Anthropocene.
It's a concept that's both fascinating and incredibly challenging because it forces us to think beyond the categories and frameworks that have shaped our understanding of the world for so long.
And it seems like Colebrook, Cohen, and Miller are all grappling with this question in their own ways, drawing on a wide range of sources from philosophy and literature to art and science.
You're absolutely right. And one of the key insights that emerges from their work is that this life beyond the human isn't about some kind of utopian future where we've transcended our limitations and achieved some kind of higher state of being.
So it's not about becoming post-human in the sense of leaving our humanity behind.
Not at all. It's more about recognizing the limits of human exceptionalism, of those anthropocentric narratives that have shaped our thinking for so long. It's about acknowledging our interconnectedness with the non-human world, our dependence on the vast web of life that sustains us.
It sounds like she's trying to find a way to affirm life in all its forms, even those forms that might seem alien or threatening to us.
Precisely. And I think this is where their work becomes incredibly challenging, but also incredibly hopeful, because it's about letting go of those old ways of thinking, those old ways of seeing the world, and opening ourselves to the possibility of something radically new.
Now, one of the things that struck me in Twilight of the Anthropocene Idols is the discussion of the post-Anthropocene unconscious.
Oh, yeah.
It seems like they're suggesting that there's a kind of collective awareness of our predicament,
Right.
even if it's often hidden beneath layers of denial and distraction.
That's a really intriguing idea, and I think it connects to Colebrook's earlier work on the death drive, because if the death drive is this tendency to negate life, to turn away from the reality of our own finitude and interconnectedness, then the post-Anthropocene unconscious might be seen as a kind of counterforce, a kind of deep-seated yearning for a way of being that's more in tune with the rhythms of the natural world.
So even in the midst of all this destruction and despair, there's a glimmer of hope,
Yeah.
a sense that something new might be emerging.
Perhaps, and I think that's one of the most important messages that comes out of their work. It's not about offering easy solutions or simple answers. It's about helping us to see the world differently, to ask new questions, to imagine new possibilities.